Welcome back to the Brewer Fanatic podcast. Jack Stern and Spencer Michaelis coming to you. It's technically Thursday night right now, but you're probably listening to this on a Friday. We have a couple of series to recap for you this week in review for the Brewers. Things are starting to heat up a little bit. We have our last month of regular season baseball, and as we might talk about a little bit later on the program, the Brewers have a pretty big division lead, but these are still some big games for them to play here coming up. And they had a couple of intra-divisional series that they played within this last week, which could have some implications as well. We'll get to that in a little bit. But before we dive into too much of the action here, Spencer, how are you doing this evening?
I'm doing well. Been a busy week. You know what's going on, but we started our fall ball for our little coaching endeavor that we have going on at the moment, and it's been a fun first week. So I'm definitely not complaining, but very busy nights every night for me. So yeah, I'm excited. Football's starting, which I know, Jack, you're not a big football guy, but I do enjoy football. So that'll help me through some of these weekends after baseball ends. And yeah, otherwise doing pretty well. How about you, Jack? Jack, before you tell me how you're doing in general, why don't you tell me about what is it called, the Pud Galvin Cup or Invitational or something? The media against Brewers employees softball game.
Well, I was going to say I'm doing great right now because about an hour and a half, maybe less so, before we started recording this, the media team defeated the Brewers front office team in the Pud Galvin Cup. So every year they're supposed to have a media versus front office softball game. This is the first time they'd had it in a few years, just because it was hard to plan the last few years, I should say. But we went out there, we got the job done. We took game one and dropped game two, so that leaves you at a tie. We didn't have time to play a third game, so we went to a home run derby swing off. And I got to give a shout out to fellow Brewer Fanatic contributor, actually, David Go. He was our choice for the home run derby. So everybody gets, or both participants, I should say, get 3 swings. Whoever hits the most homers, they won the cup. David Go went up there, took 3 hacks, destroyed all 3 of those balls, and that was enough for us to take home the Pud Galvin Cup. So really solid effort by the media crew. Nobody expected this from us. We went out, we performed anyway. In the words of Pat Murphy, we were undaunted, we were relentless. We won today. All of the catchphrases, we went out and did it. But no, it was a great time. So fun to be a part of a championship. My second softball championship that I've been a part of in as many weeks, if you can believe that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like everyone should be flocking to add you to their softball teams. You just got to show up for the playoffs too. I mean, as long as you're eligible, show up for the playoffs and you're guaranteed a chip. I'm pretty sure that's how it works. So, yeah,
I'm feeling like the equivalent of Will Smith, former Brewers reliever Will Smith, in that I'm not a bad softball player, but I wouldn't say I'm a great one either. I'm just a perfectly unremarkable softball player. Like, I'll go up there, I'll hit some line drive singles, I'll give you solid defense at first base. But other than that, I don't really have any remarkable qualities. But every time I'm on a roster, it seems like we win a championship. So that's got to count for something.
I can't imagine it being a coincidence. There's no way.
All right. Well, that's enough softball discourse. We got to jump back into some baseball content. We'll start with Milwaukee's series on the road in Cincinnati. The Brewers playing what was technically a 4-game series because the first evening of that series was a doubleheader. So the Brewers taking 3 out of those 4 games. Starting with that doubleheader on Friday, the Brewers won both of those games. Game 1 was an extra inning affair. That'll be a theme this week. A lot of extra inning games. But Milwaukee taking this one 5-4 in 10. Willy Adames and William Contreras hit home runs. Willy Adames went on a home run binge over this week. A very good week for him. Colin Ray went 4+. He came out for the 5th inning and allowed a game-tying home run to Jonathan India. It was then Brian Hudson who came out of the bullpen. He faced Ellie De La Cruz. And Spencer, I guess we can kind of dive into this one first. We have a few moves that we're going to talk about in depth here, and hopefully not all of them are going to be moves that we're all negative on. But this is one that my understanding is you thought maybe there was a little bit of overthinking from Pat Murphy on the week as a whole, and maybe this was kind of the first instance of that for you, sending Colin Ray back out there trying to get him through 5. He was not having the greatest start. There had been some loud contact in this one, so I'm kind of curious what your thoughts were as this was unfolding.
Yeah, I think there's a few factors here. So this was, like you said, he was struggling in this start. It wasn't going super well in general. His pitch count was getting up there a decent amount. He'd been giving up some hard contact. It just wasn't looking great. So India is the leadoff hitter in this game. So they're coming back around third time through. Obviously, in hindsight, it's very easy to say putting him back out there was a bad idea because India took him deep right away. My issue becomes more whether he was going to actually face Ellie or if he was only going out there for India. Like if he retired India, was he going to continue pitching or was he going out there to try and get India out and then bring in Hudson to face Ellie because Ellie's a much better hitter from the left side? I don't think that was answered at any point or asked of him, so I'm not quite sure. But if he was just putting him out there to try and get India out, I just would prefer in those cases to let your reliever start the inning fresh. If it is going to just be a one batter thing, no matter what, I don't have as much of an issue if the thought was if he can have a somewhat clean inning here, we'll let him finish the inning. So it kind of depends on where his mindset really was on this for me. And I don't know because like I said, I don't think it was talked about really. But just in general, I do remember, and I've talked about it before. I think there's been a few times this year where he's decided to leave a righty in or a lefty, whatever way, to face one batter that's same-handed and then go to the reliever. And I just think generally I would probably prefer you stick with or you let the reliever start that inning and just let him have a clean slate. I think it's a better place for them to come in. Obviously, you want relievers to be able to get out of jams and to be able to handle runners on base, but generally, I think it's a lot better for a pitcher to be able to just start his own inning and not have to worry about cleaning up anyone else's mess. So this is more iffy for me. I'm not saying he was right or wrong because I think it depends on what his true plan was. But even generally, I would have been just fine with putting Hudson in there because it was the third time through and he was not looking great coming out into that point anyway. So not my... There were plenty of decisions this week that I was, I guess, questioning. This one was more towards the bottom, but I think it was kind of the first case of maybe a little bit of an overthinking or an overmanaging type of situation from Murph.
I can understand if he wants the right on right matchup at least to start. This probably isn't how I would have played it because I'm with you in the camp of I just generally don't like we're gonna give him one guy or we give him one base runner. Like that approach to me, if that's the only leash he gets, I don't think he should even really be out there because at that point, it again, like kind of what you talked about, just give the reliever the cleaning. Now, if you're in a situation where it's like we get a couple base runners of wiggle room, then by all means send him back out there. If you're in a situation where it makes sense to have a multi base runner leash, I'm fine with that. But when the barometer or the benchmark or the turning point is one base runner, unless the guy's like throwing a no hitter or something and you want to try to get him through the game, that's a different situation, obviously. But just generally, I'm not a huge fan of he's got one base runner or he's here for this one guy. But I mean that you can't pick too much though on Murphy wanting a righty matchup, especially because Colin Ray has been quite solid against right-handed batters the last 2 years. So, but again, he wasn't necessarily in his best form today. It's kind of a toss-up for me. I probably wouldn't have played it this way, but I don't think I can look at this and say I'm upset and that it was a bad move.
Yeah, that's
So
where I am on this one.
We're not gonna talk about it a whole lot longer. We will wrap this one up, though, by noting Devin Williams locking down the save in the 10th. It was a longer inning for him, 25 pitches. and that will become a little bit relevant a few games later as we kind of look at more of the decision making from the week. Game 2, a nice easy win for the Brewers, 14-0. DL Hall going 7 shutout innings. He was called up for this game as the 27th man to start game 2. 7 shutout for him, 5 strikeouts, a walk, and 4 hits. So, Spencer, I guess I can kind of start with you here. What have you seen from DL that's been different so far? I've got my own thoughts that I'll kind of dive into if you don't take all of it from me. But obviously the knee looks a little bit healthier. The velocity is back. Is there anything else that's a little different to you compared to where he was at before he hit the injured list?
Yeah. So I don't think we'll talk about his last outing of the week, but the fastball shape is better than it was along with the velocity. So the shape has improved from where it was earlier in the year. It's still, I think, is still a little bit worse in his starts than it was in Baltimore, but
It
it's in a
is, yeah.
much better spot.
Mhm,
It's in a much better spot than it was earlier, where it was really bad earlier in the season,
mhm.
and the velo being down too made it even worse. Um, so that's part of it. He's commanding his pitches better. I mean, he's able to land his breaking balls for strikes. He's able to put them in good chase positions. Kind of early in the year, we talked about how Freddie was being uncompetitive when he would get into good counts. And I think Hall had a lot of that going on too. He was spiking a lot of the breaking balls, or he was leaving them in hittable places when he was getting into good pitchers counts. And since he's come back, he's been hitting spots really well. Um, all 4 of his pitches have been working in conjunction with each other. Like there really hasn't been a time where he can't go to one of the 4 pitches. And that's really important too, that you can trust all 4 of your pitches. I still think there's way more strikeout stuff in him, and I think he could get to that down the line. But it's just been really like 1 walk in 7 innings for him.
Mhm.
That's a big deal. Like there were some walk issues early on and just general command issues. So it's all around. He just looks a lot more like the guy I expected him to be, which has been great to see. And no matter how the rest of the season goes, I think Brewer fans at least can take some hope from these starts and from these appearances and say like, okay, now we see why they wanted him in the Burns trade, and now we can see, carrying forward, he could be a good starter, and it's nice to see that just from my perspective, because that beginning of the season was hard to watch at times. Like it was not what you were expecting at all, and knowing that, it seems pretty clear to me that the knee was playing a factor in that early in the season. And he's talked about it a little bit recently, how he just feels more comfortable now, and he's able to kind of get some of that explosion back in his delivery. So that's really what it is. But yeah, I don't know if you've seen anything beyond that or anything more specific than that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's really just not enough that can be said for the ability to just pitch with full conviction.
Yeah.
For DL, that was his push-off knee that he was dealing with the ligament damage in, so the knee that's in the leg that's on the rubber, the leg that's pushing off the rubber, and anyone who's pitched at any level of baseball knows just how important it is to get your lower body into your mechanics. So much power comes from your legs that takes stress off your arm, and just generally, if your lower half is in a good spot, it just helps everything sync up so much better. And that's kind of, I think, what we're seeing a little bit with the vastly improved command. I know throughout the season, I never wanted to give up on DL as a starter. For a period of time, I was thinking maybe just with the amount of depth that the Brewers had in the rotation, he just might not get a chance to start again. And we
Yeah.
don't know if he's going to make another start for them this year. His next outing was out of the bullpen. So maybe that ends up being the case. But I never wanted to at least give up on him being stretched out. I wanted them to make every effort they could to keep him stretched out this year. And part of the reason for that was even when the fastball was arguably one of the worst fastballs in baseball, I really believe the entire time, even in those outings where the results were not good, the secondaries were largely okay.
Yeah.
Where he was locating them, the ability to get good swings on them, like good swings for a pitcher to get swings and misses with them. I liked what we saw with the changeup, and I believe it was his second start of the year
Yep.
against Seattle at home. like to me, it was always he was just missing the fastball, and once he got that back and got some more conviction back, it was going to start to fall into place because outside of that fastball, the ingredients of an effective starter were there for me. I will say this is still not quite the fastball that I think the Brewers expected to be getting. You talked about the improved shape on it. It is a little bit better, but I don't have the numbers in front of me. I still think for the most part, though, he basically went from like 12 to 13 inches of vert to 13 to 15. Like
Yeah, pretty much.
he's still not where he was when he was coming out of the pen in Baltimore. He's kind of in the middle now a little bit, and he might not ever fully, well, I'll say this, he won't fully get back the bullpen fastball he had because that's a different animal entirely when he could really just air it out. So the velocity is where I always thought it would be as a starter, and it probably is where the Brewers thought it would be as a starter, like that 94 to 96 now. I still think there's a little bit more to be gained in the shape, and if you kind of break down his outings, all of the swing and miss is still coming from the secondaries. He's not getting whiffs on the fastball. He's just not like at all. I think in his I don't have the numbers in front of me again, but I believe it was like low single digit whiffs on fastballs in each of these last two outings. So the one in this game and then the one out of the bullpen. That's still not there for him. It helps that he's obviously got the secondaries, but that's the next step you want to see from him. Like the executing pitches has been good, the velocity's back, but I think there's still another leap to be made just with really ripping the backspin fastball and
Yeah.
then hopefully getting some more swing and miss with that too.
Yeah. I do have some numbers. So the first start back, the whiff rate was 11.8% on the fastball.
Mm-hmm.
This one we're talking about right now, it was 5.9. So
Yep. Yeah. So
not
like
where you wanted.
no whiffs. Yeah.
No, but the pen appearance, it was 22.2. And
Okay.
Jake McKibben actually tweeted today some of the whiff rates broken down by his induced vertical break. So 13 inches and lower, which he has had some, it's a 9%
Mm-hmm.
whiff rate for him. 13 to 14, it's a 16.9%. 14 to 15, 16.4. 15 to 16, it jumps to 24.4. And 16 plus is 23. So if he can be 15 or higher, that's when it starts getting into being an actual whiff offering for him. Still, I think it could get potentially even higher than the low 20s, but that's pretty good for a fastball. It's not a bad place to be for a fastball when you have those three other pitches too. So that kind of breaks it down to see like it is important for him to be able to get to 15 plus consistently. He gets good extension, so that helps everything else play up. He throws from a relatively not a super high release height.
Yeah. Well, and he's not like super tall either, so that also plays
No,
into it. Like it not
right.
just his release slot, but just the height of his arm off the ground too is also
Yeah.
part of that.
Yeah. So yeah, there's other ways. His induced vertical break isn't going to be the same as like Tobias Myers, just to explain it for like some of the people who might not understand, because Myers has that higher slot, the higher release point. So when he throws with bigger induced vertical break, it still might not act that much differently than 20 for Myers might not act that much differently than 16 for a guy like Hall is
Right.
basically where we're going with that. So
Mhm.
yeah, it's just been good to see. And I do think there's still, like we said, room for improvement.
And I think that's the benefit of now they're going to have an off season to work with him because you
Yes.
remember the Corbin Burns trade was very very late in the off season. It was only a few weeks before pitchers and catchers reported for spring training. So you really didn't have an off season to work with DL Hall. Everyone's basically first getting their hands on him within the Brewers organization in spring training. And I think just the ability now to have a full off season where you can really try to develop that fastball a little bit more. I do think that is going to make a pretty big difference for him. But like we noted, he did pitch out of the pen. Then later in the week, we'll talk about that one a little bit, not as extensively. But back to just some of the run scoring action. Rhys Hoskins was 3 for his last 45, but he hit a big 2-run home run in the 7th to make it 4-0. Things then exploded in a 10-run ninth. Willy Adames hit another 3-run home run. And then Luke Maile came in to pitch, and the Brewers teed off on him. We won't go into the specifics, but the bottom line is a lot of hits, a lot of extra bases, 10-run ninth for the Brewers. They coast to an easy 14-0 win. Game 3 would be a little bit tighter, actually a lot tighter. A 5-4 win for the Brewers, ending on a pretty thrilling play, a little bit of a high wire act. Jackson Chourio hit a go-ahead homer in the 9th, continuing to come through in big spots for the Brewers. I'd like to talk about Jackson Chourio some more, but I think we've already talked about him a lot, and I don't know if there's a whole lot more that we can add at this point other than
He's
he's
good.
really good, and it's just been a joy to watch the physical tools shine so brightly over the last 3 months. Blake Perkins with another home run robbery. I think this one was the best one that he's made that I've seen,
Yeah.
which is pretty incredible because I gave him that title on the previous one at home, where I think we broke this one down, but just the fact that he had to range and he basically had to jump into kind of this weird, not crevice, but just a weird area, kind of where the wall gets diagonal a little bit or slanted as you kind of get into triples alley there, and then he had to hang on to the ball while his hands smacked into just the stadium structure behind it, basically. But this one was even more impressive than that, I think, because he had to go back first of all, and running back on a ball is the hardest thing to do as an outfielder. Had to go straight back basically, and then when he had to leap for this one and catch it at Great American Ballpark in center field, like almost straightaway center, there's like a weird little like indent, and then there's an opening. It's kind of like where two points collide a little bit along the fence, and it makes like this weird little indent in the pattern of the wall, because normally it's just going to be kind of like round and curved the whole way across a little bit, but it's like this weird little indent. Perkins basically had to jump straight into that, and he still reached over and made the catch. Just everything about this one, I think, is the most impressive home run robbery that he's executed, which is pretty high praise considering the kind of plays that we've made him make over the last 2 years.
Yeah. That was an incredible play, and even on replay, you could see him put his foot into the wall and get up a little bit higher with it. I mean, I'll even say this, I always think robbing a homer at an opposing team's field is more difficult
Yeah,
too,
that
because
too. I forgot to say that. Yeah.
because you're
Like
just
on
not
the
as used
road.
to it. Yeah,
Mhm.
you're just not as used to the surroundings as you are at home, where you could when you're Blake Perkins is in year 2 playing at AmFam, like, he's probably run that area into that gap so many times where it doesn't take away from the catch, but he's more comfortable and he knows where he is. And in Cincinnati, especially in that weird angle where every other part of the park, he would have hit the wall before he could even jump. But he ran to the one spot, the one opening where it's 404 feet instead of 400, and
Mhm.
found his way there. And that was just a tremendous catch and ended up being very important in this game as well, as we'll talk about in a second.
So, decision number 2 that we're going to break down from the week, Devin Williams was used again in this game, and this is very, very similar circumstances to the blown save in St. Louis, where
Yep.
it was back-to-back days for him, 3 of 4, really stressful outing the night before. Just all of these things that would kind of indicate it's you're better off just staying away from him that night, because no matter what the guy says, I'm sure he's always going to say that he's good to go because he's a competitor, but there was always a chance that you come into that and you're just not quite as crisp. Just for the sake of his health as well, it's probably not best to press him in that spot. And what made this decision even rougher for me is you had Williams and McGill warming up side by side, depending on if the Brewers took the lead or tied it at least. Devin was going to come in maybe with a tie, but for sure with a save situation. Otherwise, it was going to be Trevor McGill. And so not only have you now pitched Devin Williams in a situation where he's probably better off just getting a day off. You don't really need to use him in back-to-back and 3 of 4 after a stressful 30-pitch outing the night before where he labored a little bit. But you've also burned Trevor McGill when he's not in the game, so he's now down the next day as well. He wasn't available because he got up and got fully loose. That counts. Like, I know he didn't get into the game, but guys will tell you when you go up and you're fully ready to go, like that does take some kind of toll on you, and it can impact your availability moving forward. So in my mind, just use McGill no matter what in that situation.
Yeah.
Give Williams the night off, because then you're in a situation now where no matter what happens, first of all, you're probably pitching the guy who's a little bit more fresh anyway. But also, you use McGill that night. If Devin's unavailable that night, he's good to go the next day. Instead, you ended up in a situation where you had a Devin Williams who was not very fresh again, and we'll see it in the performance here. But then you also don't have Trevor McGill available the next day. Now, both of those guys are unavailable, and the Brewers did get the win here, and I'm sure this all comes back to Pat Murphy being a little bit more willing to emphasize the game in front of him over long term. Not that he doesn't think about both things, but I think we know pretty well by this point that the way he weighs those two things and the way he tries to balance it is not quite the same as how Craig Counsell would do it when he was here. I think Murphy's a little bit more inclined to lean towards the win tonight. If you hear him talk and you kind of watch the way he manages. So this is another example of that, but Williams comes in, walks two guys, hits another guy, almost blows the save, but Jake Bauers makes a diving stop at first base with the bases loaded to end this game with a 1-run win for the Brewers. So it obviously worked out, but I think just from a process standpoint, I think you just use McGill there no matter what the situation is, kind of see where things go. But to me, that was just the better way to play this one. Fortunately, it did work out, but I try not to evaluate moves based on strictly results. Like, if I have a problem with the process before the situation even unfolds a little bit, I'm not going to look at the results to either justify myself as to whether my take was right or disprove myself as to whether my take was wrong. I still would have played this one a little bit differently. Spencer, I think you feel similarly.
Very much so. Yeah. I do think a couple things you've touched on, I just want to highlight. Like, he is still only a month back off of a major back surgery. He did have some soreness, not in his throwing shoulder, but in his left shoulder after that, the St. Louis one, where it was a little questionable if he should be used in that spot as well. And again, it wasn't like it was a back-to-back throwing 15 pitches the night before or the day before. He was up to around 25, 26 pitches in that first one, and he had pitched 2 days prior. I just think if you have Trevor McGill, who was your closer for 4 months of the season, you have Trevor McGill ready, hot, ready to go. You just go to him there and you use him, and you can live with the results on that. I would be fine if, it'd be unfortunate, but Trevor McGill could give up a run in that spot, and that's always a possibility. I truly believe, even if you're talking just in terms of trying to win today, with everything that we know in that scenario, I would feel more comfortable putting McGill in if you're trying to win today, even not factoring in the future there, because McGill is fresh. McGill's not coming off of 2 of 3 before that, and then also just the day before with the long, stressful inning. I would just feel more comfortable even just trying to win that game with Trevor McGill on the mound. So obviously happy it worked out. That does happen. And like Jack said, it's hard to do. And I understand why in the end, it's a results game. Like, results matter. But when you're judging a manager, I do think you have to try to base it off of the process more than the results, because there's plenty of times managers make the correct decision and it just doesn't work because baseball's weird and the other team beats you sometimes, and that's how it goes. There's also plenty of times where they make pretty questionable decisions and it happens to work out because of the same reasons. Sometimes you just happen to beat the other team. The other team makes a mistake and helps you out in a position where you did something that you maybe shouldn't have. So yeah, it's again, probably not a huge deal. And I don't want to make it sound like we think it was a just awful decision, but I do think it's one of those things where when you look back on it, I would think he would probably want to rethink how he did it, looking back on it and reflecting on it. And when that's the case, that means he might have got caught up a little bit in the game, trying to win today, doing stuff like that. It can catch you. And it's hard to argue with the results from the team. So winning today has worked very well for the Brewers this year. That mindset, it's a great mindset to have. So I'm not knocking Murph for it, but I do think it can get him in trouble sometimes. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. I think you can put yourself in not great positions by constantly trying to go win that current game. But yeah, it was another win, so we don't need to talk too much more about it. But it was, it did come back the next day, I would say, with the McGill part for sure.
It did, exactly. We'll get to that next game. First, I just want to make sure we got two things correct here. So the game was tied. Churio hits the home run to give the Brewers a lead. So McGill was going to pitch if it was tied.
Yes.
Williams was going to pitch if they took the lead for the save. I think I kind of butchered that a few minutes ago when I was trying to set up the situation, but that's what the situation was. So we're saying use McGill, whether it's tied or you have the lead.
Yes.
And then I don't know if you just misspoke or something. Devin didn't have back surgery. It was just the back injury. He just did rest and rehab to come back from that. But the point still stands that the point still stands. He had been on the shelf for a long time with a back injury. He's only a month into his season, so he may not be quite in the same place physically as some other guys. But I'm not going to comment on that one too much because that's one that we really just don't know anything about. But just generally, like the kind of workload here, I think in any context in that situation, I don't think it makes the most sense to go to him there, especially with McGill warming at the same time. And like we said, that impact will be felt the next day when both of those guys were unavailable. So the Brewers losing 4-3 in 11 innings. We're not going to talk a whole lot about how the Brewers got to this situation because most of the stuff to break down in this one is in extra innings. Milwaukee not scoring in the 10th or 11th. Monasterio was thrown out at home on the contact play in the 10th. So that kind of brings us to a question that you got, Spencer, from Steve. He asked just about the contact play in general. I won't read through the whole thing, but basically his question is, what are alternatives to the contact play? So he's kind of talking about how just it seems like, there is a risk reward here. Obviously, I think I've never seen any numbers on it, so it's tough to know. I generally don't have a problem with it. I know it's frustrating when it doesn't work, but I think the thought behind it is right. And I think it works more than people realize. Like if you were really paying attention, just even within the month of August, it worked a lot for the Brewers in August. Yeah. But basically what Steve is asking here is instead of just, railing on the contact play, like are there alternatives? Are there better ways to play these situations? So I'll kind of let you take this one, assuming I interpreted the question correctly.
Yeah. So in terms of alternatives, I guess there's not a ton other than you don't go or you do go, or you hit a sac fly or something or a hit instead of having to worry about the contact play. But I guess I'll break down, I think, what the general thought process on the contact play is, and maybe that will help a little bit. So generally, I would say from my point of view, the contact play should never be run with nobody out under any circumstances. In that scenario, you should be seeing the ball through. If there's nobody out, there is no reason to potentially take a guy off of third, because even if you get out at first base or whatever and the guy's still on third, you're still in a spot where an out can still score a run, a sac fly, a different infield grounder, whatever. With one out, I do think the contact play generally makes sense. Your odds of scoring go down once there's two outs because you can't score on that sac fly. You can't score on the infield ground out. You can't score on any of those things. So with one out, I do think it makes sense to go on those. I would say maybe back to the pitcher, which I do believe this is the one that Terang chopped right back to the pitcher.
Mm-hmm.
Or was that the Cardinals game? This happened twice this week.
Yeah, it did. I don't remember which one. I know what you're referring to, though, where there was a contact. I think that one was at home because I think I remember seeing that one in person.
Okay.
when
Yeah.
Terang chopped
Yeah,
it
you're
back
right.
to the mound. Because I'm pretty
Yeah.
sure that's when that was.
Okay. So either way, I would say that's the general idea. I think nobody out, it should never be on. One out, it usually makes plenty of sense. But I also think people tend to overlook the fact that a lot of times the Brewers have run it with second and third. Um, in that case, you're still going to end up with somebody on third base, even if the out does get recorded at the plate. And that's part of it too. They do expect there's a chance there's going to be an out at the plate on the contact play always. So if you have second and third and one out, you're still going to end up with that guy or one guy at least on third base with two outs, no matter what you do. Obviously, it does take one more person out of scoring position, which isn't ideal. But the contact play is also not a guaranteed out, which is where some of this is, I think, getting lost. And like Jack talked about, it did work a lot this month. All it takes is a slight bobble on the infield. All it takes is a little bit of a weird hop, and all of a sudden the infielder has to back up on it. There's plenty of ways that if you go on contact, you can beat it home. But if you don't go on contact, that bobble doesn't score the run, and they can still record the out. That little bad hop doesn't score the run, and they can still get the out at first base. It's just, I, I'm sure they have numbers on it at the major league level. And my guess would be it's a percentage play based on, again, number of outs, other runners on base, everything else that goes into it. But I do think for the most part, it's very noticeable when you get out at the plate under any circumstances, whether that's a relay from the outfield, whether it's a ground ball to the infield, no matter what it is, outs at the plate are memorable. They're easy to remember. Runs that score are kind of expected. People expect the run to score. So it doesn't stick out in your head when you think back on stuff over the course of a game. I think I'm guilty of this with like third base coaches sometimes, where I remember every time they got a guy thrown out at the plate, but I don't remember every time they stole a run by having an aggressive send. So I think it's kind of the case with the contact play. The Brewers do it a lot. I would bet they're up towards the top of the league in terms of attempting it. Again, no numbers on that, but they do have a lot of people thrown out at the plate in terms of relatively to the league. So, or relative to the league. So I would bet they do it a lot more than other teams. But that's kind of how I look at it. I think it really has to be situation by situation. And I do think in our heads, it works less often than it actually does just because of what I just talked about. So, yeah, Jack, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on it beyond that.
The only thing I'll say is I think the Brewers are also a team that's really well equipped to run that play.
Yes, they're very
The
fast.
amount of speed that they usually have on third base, like it's not like we're constantly seeing Reese Hoskins run the contact play on third base. Like you have Andre Monasterio, or if Bryce Terang's on third base, Garrett Mitchell, Sal Frelick, Jackson Churio. There are so many guys on this roster who have speed, or even if
Yep.
Joey Ortiz is on third base, Joey Ortiz has decent speed. Like it's always guys who you look at them and you say, yeah, the play can work for these guys. And I think there is an element too of just when you have a fast guy, that play happens so quick and it can put some pressure on guys. Do I think it consistently forces bad throws as often as some people might claim it does? No. I think that in general, these are big league players, and the whole applying pressure to force a misplay thing, I think that works, in high school or something. I don't think it works
Mm-hmm.
as well in the big leagues just because these guys are the best in the world at what they do. They've been doing it their whole lives. It can happen sometimes. I don't think it happens nearly as often as people say, which is quick tangent. That's part of the reason why I don't like how often the Brewers even trying to bunt for a hit. I think they do it
Yes.
more than like the effective amount of exposure would be. Like if you do it every once in a while, yeah, I think it can catch guys off guard. I think they do it too much. That's a conversation for another time. But this play in particular, I don't have any problems with how they run it because I think they pick the right situations for it by and large. And you usually have guys on the bases who can make this play work as well. And I think that's something that
Yeah.
needs to be considered as well. But we'll kind of move on from this a little bit unless you have any more thoughts, but you talked for a bit.
I
So
did.
you did, and it was good stuff. But we mentioned a few minutes ago, just talking about how using Devin Williams in that previous game while also getting Trevor McGill fully warm was not only maybe not the best move just for Williams workload wise, but also could have a ripple effect the following game. And it did, because in extra innings, Bryce Wilson basically just needed to pitch the rest of this game.
Yeah.
I don't think it ended up really making a difference in the outcome of the game, because the bigger issue is the Brewers couldn't score. But again, that's not necessarily what I'm concerned about. It's just the fact that you put yourself in a situation where you were going into today
Exactly.
knowing that there was a very good chance Bryce Wilson was just going to have to eat up a lot of innings. Like, what happens if they do score and they take the lead and it's still Bryce Wilson? Now you've put yourself in a spot where, ironically, because Pat Murphy wanted to win tonight, the night before, he couldn't win tonight as well the following night, because you had guys who were not available because of how he played that previous game. But Wilson did do a nice job. 3 2/3 from him before allowing that ghost runner to score in the 11th. He was placed on the IL a couple days later with an oblique injury. So the question now is, do we see Bryce Wilson pitch another inning for the Brewers? And furthermore, just does he have a role on this team? If he does get healthy in time, is there a place for him? I'm not sure there is, especially because you now have both Joe Ross and DL Hall in the bullpen, unless you really want to send DL Hall down. But at this point, you now have a guy in Hall who is similarly able to provide bulk like Wilson is, but also has more upside. I think the biggest knock, I think, against Bryce Wilson is the lack of upside more than anything, because his peripherals are bad. Like, most of his peripherals say he should be a bad pitcher. The results have largely been fine, but I think that is tied a little bit, though, just to the lack of upside. Like, if you get him in front of this Brewers defense, I do think they help him play up beyond the results you would expect. But again, it's just, maybe you don't have to do that with DL Hall, or maybe you don't have to do it as much with Joe Ross, who's throwing the ball well out of the bullpen. I have a hard time seeing how the Brewers are going to be able to find innings for him the rest of the way, unless somebody gets hurt, or unless, DL Hall suddenly has another rough stretch. But in my mind, you have enough guys, even in the length department now, who probably are better fits for innings at this point than Bryce Wilson. The value of Bryce Wilson is really what he can give you over the course of 162.
Yeah.
We're not in a position anymore where you're trying to get through 160. Like, we're on the tail end of that. The job's not done yet. But you're not in a spot anymore now where it's like, okay, we need Bryce Wilson to help us pace some other guys. Especially now that, again, you have similarly stretched out guys with upside. I have a hard time seeing where there's a role for him the rest of the way.
Yep. I'm in the same spot. I think you could even include Ashby, being a guy who can give you multiple.
Oh, yeah.
Not quite as stretched, but
right.
He can give you multiple innings out of the pen. So you have at least 3 guys who can very clearly and already have shown the ability to go 2+, 3+ if needed. So it's hard to see him fitting back in, and it's unfortunate for him, obviously, because especially having it come off of probably his best appearance in a while, would be potentially his final one with the Brewers this year. But I think you pretty much nailed it when you said he's the guy that helps you over the course of a regular season. And I can't imagine him being on a playoff roster, no matter whether he comes back or not. I don't think he makes the playoff roster, even if he pitches again in the regular season. So I think right now in September, the Brewers should probably be doing their best to find who they want in their playoff bullpen. And by doing that, I think you need to have the guys that have legitimate chances at making that roster or taking one of those roster spots, pitching as often as you can, obviously stretching them in a healthy manner and not, when I say as much as they can, I mean in a smart way, handling that in a good way. But I don't see a role for him barring injury, like you said.
With that, we'll move on to the Cardinals series. So after that Cincinnati series, the Brewers returning home to kick off a slightly longer homestand, not one of those little 3-gamers that we saw last time. So 6-game homestand for Milwaukee here. But they kicked it off with a 3-game set against the Cardinals. They won 9-3 in game 1. They would then drop the following 2 for a series loss. Still has been a very successful year for Milwaukee, though, against their rivals from St. Louis. 9-3 in game 1. Willy Adames once again continuing his power binge and 3-run homer binge, hitting his 13th 3-run home run of the season that tied the MLB record previously set by Ken Griffey Jr. And he also tied the Brewers franchise record by homering in 5 consecutive games. So really good stuff from Willy Adames in this one. That brings us to one of our first listener questions. Cheesehead Kami asked us on Twitter, given Adames' connection to many young players in the clubhouse, could we see him take a high annual value but short contract this season? I assume he means from the Brewers.
Yeah.
No.
No.
I don't see that happening. And I think really just the reason for that is as bad as the defense has been compared to what we've normally seen, the offense has also been as good as ever. So I think when you just weigh those two things and especially just look at the offensive numbers, he could not be having a better platform season for free agency at the plate. And the glove is definitely a concern. Maybe there's a world where the offers aren't quite what he wants because teams don't think he can play shortstop.
Yeah.
But even if the offers aren't quite what he wants, I just can't see him saying, yeah, I want to hit free. I want to try my luck again in a year or 2, maybe 3. I just can't see that happening. Like, I think his camp knows that he's not going to have a better platform year than this for hitting free agency. And I think with that in mind, just a short-term deal for me feels like it's out the window. I think he would want the long-term security. His representation would want the long-term security because I think those folks know that this is still his best opportunity to get it. I don't think he's going to be able to get it if he hits the market again in a couple of years. He's also just in a spot where he's not going to have a ton of competition at the shortstop position on the free agent market. That needs to be factored in as well versus, granted, I haven't looked at what the market's going to look like in a few years, but even if you don't know for sure, I think you still look at this market and say, you know, there's nobody else out there at the shortstop position of Adames' caliber. So there is the connection to the clubhouse guys, but in a lot of ways, everything is pretty much unfolding in a worst case scenario for the Brewers' odds of retaining Willy Adames. So people need to be fully prepared for him to leave unless the Brewers want to offer him a fair market value contract that rivals what he's getting from other teams. That's what it's going to take.
Yep. I was going to say, if you're dreaming on any sort of hometown discount, it would probably come at the hand of, a couple million less a year over the course of a long contract still, if you were going to get anything in that way. It wouldn't shock me if he did take a little bit less to stay in Milwaukee if the Brewers were to offer him, the 6 years he might get out on the market, but maybe even more than that. But I agree with Jack. I think Brewer fans probably need to just enjoy the next month or hopefully close to 2 months of Willy Adames in a Brewers uniform and be prepared for him to leave. And it won't be, frankly, I don't think it would be a wrong decision by the Brewers to let him walk, given what we have seen with the defense falling back. And listen, the clubhouse thing is real. He's legitimately, that's a big deal. He's loved by people in the clubhouse. He is a fantastic person and teammate, and he clearly gives everything he's got at all times. So he will be missed if he leaves. Like, don't get me wrong on that. Don't get it twisted. He is an important part of the Brewers. But there's also still a point where you can't afford in the Brewers situation to pay a guy like that, given his defense falling off and the fact that he is going to be getting paid based off of a career offensive year. Like, those are usually the type of contracts you want to avoid on the open market. Unfortunately for the Brewers, a team like the Dodgers or the Yankees or whoever might be in the market for a shortstop, those types of rules don't necessarily apply to them in terms of having to worry about those things. So they can afford to take that risk where the Brewers probably can't. So it's unfortunate, but I do think that's the reality of where we're at with Willy at this point.
Yeah, and just from Milwaukee's perspective too, I do think a few years ago my take was a little different because I thought there was another gear to Adames that we hadn't seen yet. And I guess in some way the fact that he's having it's like right in line with a career year. He's kind of hovering right around the output he had a few years ago. But to me, just having watched him for the last few years and still watching him now, I don't think he's going to age well with the bat. I really don't, because even with some of the improvements he's made to not chasing quite as many pitches, he's gotten his chase rate down to league average compared to being very aggressive beforehand. But still, the fact that we still do see some chase sometimes, it's usually a big max effort swing, a long swing. I don't think it's going to age very well. And I think there is a very real chance, especially now that the glove has fallen off, that, if you give him that deal, I think there is a chance you could end up being stuck with a third baseman who hits for below average offense more years than not during the life of that contract, depending on how long it is. But like if it's a 6-year contract, I could see 3 to 4 years of third baseman who's a below average hitter.
Yeah.
And that's just not something the Brewers can afford to have. If you're a bigger market team, you can take on that risk and hope that Adames continues to hit the ceiling for a little longer. But I think he's going to be gone. It is going to hurt the Brewers in the clubhouse, and they are going to have to find ways to replace both the on-field and clubhouse value. You have Joey Ortiz moving to shortstop next year, most likely, but then you have to fill third base. So in that way, you're still trying to fill Adames. And then there's the clubhouse stuff as well. But I think when the dust settles, he's going to be gone. It's going to sting. And then a few years down the line, when you're kind of removed from it, everyone's going to look at it and say, yeah, it sucked, but it was the right move. It was the right decision.
Yep.
Just to keep him for the entirety of his club control, because he gives you so much value while he's here. And then you let him walk, and you let another team pay for the years that might not be so great. And it's not going to be fun in the moment, but I think it's going to be one of those situations where down the line, as everyone's looking back at it, people are going to say, yeah, the Brewers played this situation as well as you can. So I kind of think that's the direction this is all headed. We'll pivot, though, to a young player who will be in Milwaukee for a long time. We talked about Jackson Chourio. He hit a grand slam in this game to really blow this one open for the Brewers. His stats now, going into basically the morning that people are listening to this, if you're listening the day it went up on Friday, his stats on the season are now up to a 279, 332, 471 slash line. His OPS is over 800 now, which is absurd when you consider that it was at 575 going into June. That's where it's at the end of May. He has now a 120 WRC plus, 19 home runs, 20 steals. He will be the youngest player in MLB history to reach 2020, assuming he hits one more home run in the next 3.5, 4 weeks, however long we have here. So it's pretty incredible what we're seeing from him right now. Again, not a whole lot more that can be said about that because we have talked about it a lot. Joe Ross doing a nice job out of the bullpen. We name dropped him a few minutes ago as a guy who's done a nice job out of the bullpen. He threw 2 scoreless. Since moving to the pen, he is now at 15 innings, 15 strikeouts, only 4 walks, 8 hits allowed. He has a 0.6 ERA and a 1.99 FIP. I will say, I thought we were going to see more of a velocity bump from Joe Ross out of the bullpen. That really hasn't been there. But otherwise, I think it has been a lot of kind of what we had talked about a few weeks ago. Just this 2-pitch sinker slider mix just plays so much better the first time you're facing an opponent. Just get him in out of the bullpen, and he's done a nice job since he's moved there.
Yeah. I won't pat ourselves on the back because we actually had Ryan Top do it on Twitter for us, so we don't have to. But this is what we were this is why we thought it would work in the pen. And like you said, we did expect, I think both of us were thinking we might see some more like 98s thrown in there once in a while or something.
So
He's
I
mostly
won't take full credit for it because it hasn't quite been everything we thought it could be, but like a
Yeah.
lot of the reasons why it's working are still some things that we kind of had in the back of our minds, like this is why it could happen. He just hasn't
Yeah.
quite checked all of those boxes, but you can't argue with the results.
No. And like, I mean, the FIP backs up not quite to the ERA, but it does show that he has on the peripheral, he's done well as well. So it's good to see. And it matters because that type of role can be helpful in a playoff series because he's the type of guy who could get you leverage outs if needed and also could give you multiple innings if needed in lower leverage or whatever type of leverage. So it's kind of what we were hoping we could take him and replace the Bryce Wilson role with a guy like Ross. And so far, I think that's basically what we've seen.
Yeah. So we're going to lump games 2 and 3 of this series together because in a lot of ways they were pretty similar, both extra innings losses for the Brewers. The theme in both of them was that the Brewers could not hit with runners in scoring position in this series. What's the number? I think they went like 1 for 26 or something between these two games. Don't quote me on that. I know I put it in a story. I know I put it in a story I wrote, so I should remember it, but it's something in that range. I know they went like 0 for 15 in game 2.
Yep.
But really, since the fifth inning of the second game of this series, just nothing happening for the Brewers offensively. There's no reason to be concerned. They are still the second best team in baseball with runners in scoring position. And guess what? Every single team in baseball goes through stretches where they don't get some hits with runners in scoring position. They don't execute. They're held off the board for a few games. In the story that went up on Brewer Fanatic on Thursday that I put together, I looked at for a minute, like the 3 best offenses in baseball this year by WRC Plus are the Yankees, the Orioles, and the Dodgers. All 3 of those teams have had multiple streaks throughout the year, like several streaks throughout the year in which they didn't score more than 3 runs in consecutive games or 3 games in a row. I think the Yankees and the Orioles both had stretches of 5 straight games where they scored 3 runs or fewer in each game. Like it happens to every single lineup. Just because it happens for a couple days does not mean it's suddenly an inherent problem with this team. The overall sample still shows us that it isn't. And also just hitting with runners in scoring position is generally a very random stat.
Yeah.
Simply because teams are not magically changing their approach with runners in scoring position. Like teams are not going up there with men on base and suddenly doing something that is going to be less conducive to success as a hitter compared to anything you might be doing with the bases empty. Maybe that's a better way to frame it. Like, I'm not going to say the approach never changes because there could be times where, if you have that guy on and that's a big run or something, maybe you play more for a single or something, or you play more for getting him over, whatever. But guys are generally not coming up at the moment there's runners in scoring position and suddenly getting into bad habits that they're not getting into when the bases are empty, is the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah. And I think, just to bounce off of what you said, I do think kind of similar to what I talked about earlier with the contact play and third base coaches. You always remember when the runs don't score with runners in scoring position because it sticks out in your head. And I think every fan base probably thinks their team sucks at hitting with runners in scoring position until you look at the numbers, because it is one of those things that it's always a big black mark when you don't score runs, when you have a potential possibility to, when you have a nice situation for the offense and you don't put the runners across the plate, it just always sticks out in everybody's head more than when they do score. Because again, that's what's expected by the fans. So I will say that. And I will just slightly say, you talked about how the approaches don't change. I actually do think that was part of the reason the Brewers didn't do super well recently. They played like they were trying to get 1 run in extras. It felt like a lot. Like it seemed like there was a slappy, let's hit a ground ball to the right side for the first hitter approach, and then we'll get them in. There's no way to 100% say that that's the case, but I think visually it looked different for a lot of the at-bats. where it was like, okay, we're going to move the runner. And that's fine. Like, it's not a terrible approach. But I would rather just see you do what you're talking about. And that's just go hit, go play baseball, go try and knock that run in with a double in the gap. Like, you don't need to try and manufacture the run. You can just score it by hitting. So I do think there was a little bit of that in this series, and even the other extra innings game with the Reds, where it almost felt like they were so focused on, like, we got to get that guy in from second, instead of being like, let's go hit and be ourselves and do that. And I do think that's something that a young team can fall into. I'm not saying that's a manager telling them to do that or anyone. I just think that's something where young players can get that in their head of time.
Yeah. Sorry if
You're
I'm
good.
butting in. For the amount of times we do nitpick some elements of Pat Murphy's managerial style, I can tell you he's not telling guys to consistently do stuff like that, because a lot of times when they do, you can either see it in his responses or you can see it in his face. Like, he's a lot of times just as confused as a lot of other people as to why they're doing that. Now, maybe you can ask questions about why it seems to be so ingrained in these players' heads that that's how they need to play. Like, if that's a theme across so many of these guys, I think you can't ask the question of, well, it sure feels like that needs to be coming from somewhere, even if guys aren't intending to instill that message. But Pat Murphy's not directly telling these guys to just play small ball night and day or every time a man gets on base. He's not doing that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, like you're saying, it might be a case of some phrasing on certain things that are causing players to think they need to play that way or something, but he's definitely not openly telling them to do this. But I do think you could see it in some of the approaches in these games. And I do think that was part of the reason they struggled to put guys across, because when you get in that mindset, you're not on the attack. You're on the, I need to do this exact thing to try and score the run, instead of just going up and hitting. So it's not a huge deal. It's just something you hope doesn't, come up when you are in a playoff series, where it could become a little bit of a bigger deal at that point.
Another takeaway that we have from this series, Aaron Savali got the start in game 2, and it was kind of a tale of two outings for him, both in terms of results, but also just in terms of how he pitched. And this one was really interesting to watch, because he basically went from doing the things that make the two of us mad when certain Brewers pitchers are pitching this way. That's what he did in the first inning. But then the rest of the start, he essentially mixed things exactly how we want to see him mix things. So in the first, and I'll preface this again before I jump in again, Aaron Savali is not quite the same as some other Brewers pitchers, like Colin Ray, namely, who is going to thrive off of mixing his 3 fastballs, because that makes up such a huge part of his arsenal. Aaron Savali, on the other hand, now that he's got the shorter slider that he brought back, which, by the way, you can read that story about how that happened at Brewer Fanatic. I wrote about it a few days ago, about the Brewers, just why they came to Aaron Savali and wanted him to bring that shorter slider back to add to his other breaking balls. But he's got 7 pitches now, is the point. And his best pitches are his breaking stuff, because now he's got the sweeper, the curveball, the short slider. Like, those are his best pitches. And it's also just such a deep arsenal that it just makes the most sense to mix things in a really balanced fashion. He didn't do that in that Oakland start with William Contreras behind the plate, and we had an in-depth discussion about that a few weeks ago. It was better in his last start when Gary Sanchez was behind the plate for him. And then in this start, you had William behind the plate for him again. So in the first inning, 76% fastballs. I believe this was like a 20-something pitch inning. 76% of his pitches were fastballs. 33% of his pitches were just 2-seamers alone. And then 24% of his pitches are breaking balls. He gave up 3 doubles and 2 hard hit outs in the first inning to score 2 runs. All 3 of those doubles and the 2 hit hard outs, they were all on sinkers. So they were teeing off on the sinker or the 2-seamer. It's probably more of a 2-seamer for him if you just look at the shape of it, because it doesn't really think, it just runs. But that 2-seamer, they were on it, and it's not his best pitch. Like, he's going to need to use it just for the sake of establishing a fastball with some arm side movement. He does need to show it. He needs to show everything in his arsenal. But the bottom line is, it can't be the main feature like it has been at times. It was in that first inning, and then the rest of that start, only 53% fastballs, only 19% of his pitches were 2-seamers, 41% of his pitches were breaking balls. So for the rest of this start, that being the final 4 innings, because he went 5 in this one, 3 hits allowed, The only run was a Paul Goldschmidt homer on a hanging curveball. 7 strikeouts. I think at one point he had like 5 in a row or something. Don't quote me on that number, but he had a stretch where he was really mowing guys down and getting swing and miss. So this to me just really illustrates it well. Like what he was doing those last 4 innings is how the mix needs to be. And it, granted, it's not going to be the same thing every single time. You do have to weigh in, who you're facing, what kind of swings you're seeing that night. But this needs to be like the core, like the starting point for him. Just
Yes.
go out there and mix stuff like this, mix the fastballs and the breaking balls. Let the breaking balls do the heavy lifting sometimes when need be. Just let everything play off everything. Cover all areas of the zone, cover all shapes, and don't let guys key in on the fastball. That's how he needs to pitch, and it's exactly what he did over these last 4 innings, and it worked spectacularly. So really good stuff to see there. And just credit to both guys too, both Savali and William Contreras for making that adjustment after the first inning. It really turned that game around for Savali. The Brewers still lost, but it turned that start around, and it turned it into still not a great line, but I think especially when you consider the context of how he finished, it was a competitive start that kept the Brewers in the ballgame, and that's really what you're hoping for from Aaron Savali.
Yeah, exactly. And you touched on a main point there. It's nice to see it happen with Contreras behind the plate. It's good to see him make that adjustment. Who knows where that started, whether it was Savali talking to him, a coach talking to him, whatever. Either way, it was a big change. And it was a notable one to a point where clearly it was a concerted effort to change the approach after that first inning. It wasn't just happenstance that he all of a sudden got to this more balanced approach. But more than anything, just hopefully it means, like you said, this will be a good jumping off point. You do need to read the swings. There are going to be teams who don't hit fastballs as well. There's going to be days where Savali spots his fastball super well, and it makes more sense to use it because he can get it wherever he wants it on that day or whatever. But this is more in line with what we're hoping to see as the base. So it was good to see. And like you said, not a great final line, but you give up 3 or less and 5 or more, you keep your team in the game every time that happens. Like your team has a chance when you leave the mound every time you're able to do that. That used to be what qualified for a Colin Ray special. That was the original Colin Ray special.
That was the original Colin Ray special. But if you can get Colin Ray specials from Aaron Savali, you're getting what you're hoping for.
Yes.
Game 2, Elvis Peguero made his return to the bullpen as part of a series of roster moves. The Brewers notably sending Brian Hudson down to the minor leagues. We can maybe talk about that a little bit later towards the end of the show. But bottom line, Peguero was back, and kind of a cruel twist of fate, immediately thrown into a spot where he inherited a runner. Things didn't go well. The game got away from him. Okay, so we just spent all this time talking about Savali's pitch mix. This one was a little iffy for me because he got ahead 1 and 2 on a really uncomfortable looking swing on a bullet slider in the dirt. And I believe there was one slider thrown the rest of the sequence. He went back to a sinker. Then I think he threw a slider, fouled off, and then it was just sinkers the rest of the way. To me, I think there was a better chance to put him away. Elvis didn't help anything by just not executing some pitches. But I think you could have put him away with another breaking ball there, just doubling up. But that's not really the main gripe here because Peguero just did not do well. Couldn't put that guy away through a wild pitch. Just things spiraled out of control. And that's really when things got out of hand for that 7-4 loss. We've criticized Murphy before for the situations he's put him in. This had nothing to do with Pat Murphy. They were just in a spot where it was getting later in the game. You got to throw someone.
Yeah.
Peguero's fresh. And this was the 12th inning when they used him. Like, it's not like he was first on the pecking order or anything. This is just a spot where he was the guy who needed to be used based on how deep we were into the game at this status, at this point, I should say. And it didn't go well. I think he got too much, I don't want to say hate, but just too many negative comments made about him, I think, from the fan base after this outing. Like, people saying that he's not a major league caliber pitcher, that he should be DFA'd or something. Like,
Yeah.
that's extreme. I know he didn't pitch well in this outing, but like the reality is he's a major league caliber middle reliever who has some warts in his profile.
Yep.
And especially since he has the option left, there's no need to DFA him or anything like that. And it was just bad timing. I think that given what had happened in some outings before he was sent down, and I don't think all that was his fault. He was put in spots where he wasn't set up to succeed, and that made him look worse than he is. But then he just, by this time, by pure product of circumstance, is thrown into a tough spot and does not pitch well when you already had people in the fan base who had this perception of him.
Yeah.
He's a fine major league caliber reliever, and I think some of the takeaways that some people had from this outing were off base. Granted, I don't know if there's necessarily a spot for him on the big league roster the rest of the way, just given the names who are in front of him when everybody's healthy. But I mean, he's still a guy who I would expect to be part of the bullpen mix in 2025. He has good stuff, can still figure it out. I will say it wasn't a good look when he did not go to cover third base during a play, to go back up third base. That is something that can't happen, and that needs to improve. But by and large, this is still a guy who can make an impact long term. I think some people are overreacting given what they had seen the last couple times out that he had pitched. Some of it his fault, some of it not.
Agreed. I think the main takeaway is that he's not someone who's making the playoff roster like we talked about with Wilson. He has that option. There's no reason to DFA him currently. That they can still clear 40-man spots in a number of ways if they need to do so without DFAing Elvis. He has the stuff to be a major league reliever, and I would expect him to be part of the mix next year. Like you said, I really have not much more to say on that.
Game 3, we got one more bullpen decision to dissect here. So I guess it's really not the bullpen. It's mainly just that Yoel Payamps came into the game in the 10th with the ghost runner on. You had a left-handed bat and then 2 right-handed bats and then another left-handed bat in Brendan Donovan. So Payamps records the first 2 outs on 4 pitches. And I think Pat Murphy just did not want him to pitch to Nolan Arenado. Basically, he liked the matchup of Hobie Milner pitching to Brendan Donovan more than he liked Yoel Payamps pitching to Nolan Arenado. So he walked Nolan Arenado with 2 outs and a runner on third to bring in Milner to face Brendan Donovan. And just so we're clear on this, like, Milner was fine. Milner, it was a hard hit ground ball, but a ground ball nonetheless. You're inheriting a guy on third base. He gave up a ground ball and struck a guy out. He pitched fine. And Murphy did say that he wanted the ground ball there, so I get that, but wanted the ground ball from Milner, that is, thought Milner could get the ground ball. But really, this isn't so much about Milner as it is Yoel Payamps can get the 2024 version of Nolan Arenado with 2 outs. He can pitch to him. I just don't. I really struggle to see the need to put him on base, especially with 2 outs, because with 2 outs, an out ends the inning. It's not like he could hit a deep fly ball and that scores a run. Like, that's it. There's 2 outs. I could maybe see it if you still had 1 out and you want to set up the double play or something for Donovan. I do think that to Murphy's credit, he did. So the Cardinals pinch hit for Donovan with Luke and Baker, who hit the single off of Milner. Murphy did say post-game that the Cardinals don't always do that, and we did look it up. They don't. They don't always hit for Donovan against a lefty. So I'm not actually going to like say that Murphy got outplayed on that one, because I do think that there was a reason to believe they might not do it. To me, though, like, that part of the conversation doesn't matter, because Payamps just should have pitched to Arenado anyway, and I think Payamps could have gotten him out. Murphy said that in his mind, or at least he thought, Arenado was swinging the bat great lately. He also said that Payamps has pitched a lot and doesn't have much fuel. So two things there. Arenado has not swung the bat well lately. I also just don't care about that as much because I think you're kind of opening a can of worms if you're making your decisions based on what he's done lately, because that can look so different based on what kind of sample. Like, are you looking at how's he doing tonight? How did he do last in the series? How did he do the last week? And it just changes so much almost it can change at bat to at bat almost. So I think if you just want the
Right.
most now, like if you have it's different if you have like Jackson Churio and it's swinging the bat lately is what he's done the last 3 months.
Yes.
That's a completely different situation. But if what he's doing lately is like you're looking at the last week or that game or that series, like to me, it's not the most grounded decision. And I would gravitate toward the bigger sample, which says that Arenado is not a bad hitter. He's still above average, but he's not the huge threat that he was 2-3 years ago. If this is 2-3 years ago, I would absolutely walk Arenado, and because then the matchup on deck does
Yes.
put you in a better spot. I would have been okay with it then, but this is the 2024 version of Arenado, and it's also interesting to me because what Murphy said about Arenado is actually what's been going on with Goldschmidt, and he pitched to
Yeah.
Goldschmidt. Like Goldschmidt is the veteran name recognition guy who is actually swinging a hot bat right now. So if you wanted to make that case for him, I would have said probably still would pitch to him, but I could at least see it like why you would come from that angle. But it doesn't really hold up for Arenado. And if Piamps is, in Murphy's words, not having much fuel, I guess I'm confused why he's out there to begin with, because that raises like a whole another avenue of questions. It was a weird move. And this is like one of the ones where I'm going to say I thought it was not just a weird move, but a bad move. Like he
Yeah.
should not have done this. I didn't like it from the moment they called for the intentional walk. And you could tell this always seemed to be the plan because Milner was like ready when that inning started. He
Yeah.
was good to go for when it got to that spot. So it seemed like he really just did not want to pitch to Arenado no matter what, is what seemed to be happening. He didn't come out and outright say that, but if you just kind of read between the lines a little bit and look at the situation, it really just seems like it all came down to he did not want Nolan Arenado to beat him. When I wrote kind of the breakdown of how Murphy has been a lot more liberal this year with choosing to walk guys than Craig Counsell has been, I did note in that article, like it's almost always worked for them. I think at the time they only had like 5 instances where 5 like out of over 20 where you put the guy on and a run scored at some point within the rest of that inning after the walk. But in this situation specifically, I don't think this is you don't need to put the 2024 version of Nolan Arenado on base with 2 outs. You just don't.
Yeah.
Like you're foregoing what I think is a pretty good chance to get him out. And if Piamps is gassed, okay, does that change the equation? Maybe, but then it just switches to why is he in there?
Right.
So like there's never to me, there's like I give Murphy credit for laying out his rationale, but to me, there's nothing in the explanation that has me thinking, oh, okay, like I didn't see that before, but I can understand that now. It's fine. Like I didn't get any of that from this explanation.
Yeah. I don't have too much to add on this. I think you pretty much laid it out exactly how I view it as well. I think you could even make the argument that if you were worried about Arenado, you could just kind of do the whole, pitch around him and see if you can get a couple chases and then go for the strikeout or whatever, go for the out if you can get ahead early. I think just straight up intentionally walking this version of Nolan Arenado is weird. And it's especially weird because, like you said, he's had no problem going after Goldschmidt, not just in this game, but you think back a couple weeks ago when they were in St.
Mhm.
Louis, he intentionally walked Donovan to get to Goldschmidt. And I thought that was the right move for the record. But it's just weird that he's viewing Arenado as a huge threat right now, and Goldschmidt, he seems to not view as big a threat when if you look at, especially if you're using his lately qualification, Goldschmidt's been pretty good for a little while now. And Arenado, no matter if you take a week or a month, he's been okay. He's been below average the last couple weeks, and on the month, it's basically a league average hitter. So just all around a weird one. Like like you said, I think it was a bad decision. I also will say managers make bad decisions and overthink things sometimes. It's part of the deal. There's a lot of stuff you have to make decisions on. So I'm not going to kill him for this, but it kind of topped off a week of kind of some interesting calls, I guess. So it may have highlighted it a little bit more.
We're going to take a question related to the bullpen from Casey. He asked, can you provide any reasoning as to why Elvis and Hobie would be put on the active roster before Craig Yoho and Jacob Mizorowski? I don't know if we mentioned this. Milner had been activated off the IL as part of the series of moves that the Brewers made, including bringing Peguero back to the big leagues. So that's why you saw Milner in that situation. But again, back to the question, why are those guys on the active roster before Yoho and Jacob Mizorowski? The answer is, well, number one, it's just based on roster flexibility. Like, these guys are already on the 40-man roster. You don't have to clear space for them. And I if you're going to bring Craig Yoho or Jacob Mizorowski to the big leagues and start the clock on those guys and make room for them on the 40-man roster, I think you have to be in a spot where you like really, really need one or both of those guys. I think one or both of those guys can help the Brewers, but I don't know if they're in a position where you really need them right now.
Yeah.
And I think that's speculatively, I think that's why the Brewers are thinking the way they are.
Yep. I agree with that. I think both Yoho and Miz have shown a little bit of, some holes in their game as well at AAA. Yoho has walked a few more at AAA than he was. Miz's last couple outings have been a little bit more of the command concerns that you will tend to have with him. So there's also reason to be a little bit concerned about them just coming up and being able to dominate. It's not that simple. They can't just come up and be guaranteed to go get a bunch of outs at the major league level. And like Jack said, you got to worry about the 40-man spot when you're thinking about all of this. The Brewers can clear a space or two pretty easily, especially because they haven't even put Yelich on the 60-day yet. He's still sitting on the 10-day right now. So that's an easy way to clear one if they need to. But you still have Enoli Paredes potentially coming back soon, who could be a major league option over the two that we talked about in Elvis and Hobie. It sounds like Bukauskas, from what I've heard, is probably pretty unlikely. But he was a potential end of September guy. And again, he's a guy I would probably take over those two. So if you need bullpen beyond those guys or pen arms beyond those guys, and you don't need to open up 40-man spots and start clocks, I get it. I do think it would still be potentially one of them could make the playoff roster. That wouldn't shock me, in Yoho or Mizorowski if they came up. But I don't think they'd be guaranteed to at the moment. And I think that's kind of where what Jack was saying. They need to be guaranteed, basically, to be up and ready to help and able to help for it to be worth everything else that comes with it.
Yeah, pretty much. With that, we'll move on to some loose ends, answer a few more questions. We'll start with Mason, who asks, what is your ideal playoff rotation? If you could talk through a wild card scenario and a bye scenario. I'm not sure. I'm not sure it really matters what series you end up in, because you're just going to line up the best guys to start games so you can advance. But I think you're starting Freddie Peralta in game one. The rest of it gets pretty tricky, honestly, because it's a lot of guys who are all in very similar territory. You could go Colin Ray game two. You could go Tobias Myers game two. I might take Ray over Myers simply because Ray is more experienced, maybe not in the playoffs, but just more experienced in general. So if you hand him a game two start, and to me, like, those two guys are just in very similar territory performance-wise. So if it's two guys who are in the same territory performance-wise, I think I'll take the guy who's been around longer and just throw him in the bigger spot. After that, I think it's got to be Frankie Montas based on how he's thrown the ball so far. And then you can line up Myers for game four if you need to. It's all kind of a toss-up because you have a rotation that's mainly just Freddie Peralta and then a bunch of guys who are very similar. So it is hard to line up. It could end up being based on just who they're facing and how hitters match up against each of these arms, because if you have a lot of guys who are all kind of in the same territory, you might pick the guys who, based on what they throw or based on some splits, guys who are potentially the better matchup just for your opponent. So I think that might end up being a real determining factor. But Freddie at number 1, Ray at number 2, probably. I think those are the only ones I'm really willing to throw out for now. But it's you can just about make a case for anybody, because they all kind of are in similar territory of where they've thrown the ball well, but the upside is a little bit limited for all of these guys. So I think the only guy I'm probably not putting in the playoff rotation, I don't think I'd throw Savali in there right now. I'm not sure he's quite at the same point as all these guys. It's still a somewhat similar profile if things work out for him, but I don't think we've quite seen the same consistency from him as we've seen from some guys like Ray, Myers, Montas. So he might be the odd man out. But other than that, I mean, really just those other 3 guys right behind Freddie Peralta, that's probably who you're rolling with. I don't know if you have any different thoughts. I kind of rambled for a little bit there.
No, you're good. I would say the only thing I could see potentially beyond what you're saying is, but at the back end, it could be kind of a piggyback situation where they use 2 of those guys to try and get through a good chunk of a game, instead of just going one pure starter, and more just saying, hey, you're going to see 1 time through, maybe 2, and then the other guy's going to see 1 time through, maybe 2. And that's how we're going to eat a bunch of the innings in this one, and also keep them on their toes and get both of those, whoever those arms are, on the roster and give them an opportunity to do their thing in a playoff series. So that's probably the only thing I could see beyond what you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes some sense. I wouldn't be surprised if they did that at all. We'll take a question from Patrick, who asks what the Brewers are going to do with Tyler Black. Said the offensive profile seems very similar to Frelick, so DH and first base don't seem like options long term. Left field would push Yelich to DH and pack the outfield picture. I think the Brewers are, I don't know if I'm going to say trade Tyler Black, but I do think this is finally the offseason when they move somebody.
Yep.
Simply because you've seen more of these guys now, and I think you do. One, you just have a better idea of where they are stealing wise in the big leagues. You don't really know that for sure until they step in the box against big league hitting. Obviously, you try to project that as best you can, but I think that plays a role in it. I understand the similarities to Frelick in that it's kind of the on-base profile doesn't hit the ball super hard. It's hard to say for sure how it's going to play in the big leagues because the sample's so small. Like in the small sample, it looks exactly like Frelick, but you don't know that that's necessarily going to hold up. I might pass that one off to you a little more because you watched way more of him in the minor leagues than I did. But my guess is either he's the guy who's moved or they find a way to open up a spot for him in the outfield.
Yep.
I feel like it's got to be one of those 2 things, because he really just hasn't picked up first base great. When he was up here the last time, I think he only DH'd. I don't think they even put him in the field. So like it just seems like it's at this point you got to bite the bullet with the outfield. Whether he ends up playing outfield here or somewhere else is kind of TBD.
Yep, I agree. And I guess I would say I think Black's like batted ball profile will make him a little bit more likely to hit for power, not a ton of power in the majors. I don't think he hit more homers in the minors than I think we'll ever see him hit in the majors in a season. But he does actually have the ability to kind of pull the ball in the air a little bit more often, and with some backspin, which helps the ball carry a little bit. Frelick hits a lot of topspin liners and stuff because of the way his bat path works and the way he swings. So he can't, even on his best contact, it often doesn't get out because that's just kind of how his batted balls work. So I do think I'm kind of starting to believe that Mitchell's not getting moved unless somebody makes a Godfather offer for him. Not because that's how I think, but because I think that's kind of how he's being viewed internally. And because he is the best center fielder of the 3 of them defensively, which the Brewers do value quite a bit. And I do think one of Black or Freelick is going to get moved this offseason. I just would be surprised if both of them are still with the team come around in spring. Even though I say, like, I think Black has more power, I do think in a lot of ways they're pretty similar. And you're going to get a similar type of player, and it's hard to carry two lefties with that type of profile in your outfield in an already crowded outfield. So I would be kind of surprised if both are there next year.
This will be a quick one. Nate asks, why is Jesse Winker good now? Because he's healthy. That's the answer. He's not coming off of spine surgery and knee surgery that had him walking like the Tin Man last year. He's just, if you watch him, he was able to slim down. He's moving so much better. I think he was just in a spot last year where he was good enough to play in games, but you could tell he hadn't fully worked back form-wise from the offseason procedures that he underwent. Basically, what happened was the Brewers were a year too early on, what they were hoping was going to happen with Jesse Winker. What we're seeing this year from him is what the Brewers thought they were getting last year. They just happened to be a year early on him. Steve asks us on Twitter, this is a different Steve than the previous Steve, right?
Yep.
A lot of Steves out there on Brewers Twitter. He asks about Robert Gasser's service time, given that he is on the 60-day IL as he recovers from Tommy John. So, Spencer, do you want to answer this one?
Yeah, so he does still accrue service time while on the IL. All players on the IL accrue service time while they're on it for the major leagues, which is part of the reason Oliver Dunn had to go on the major league IL instead of going down to AAA and going on the IL, because he got hurt in the major leagues. Like, that's the reason they do it. It's to protect the players so that teams don't option them and then put them on the IL and screw them out of service time. But he doesn't lose rookie eligibility. I don't know if he quite surpassed that number. He was close either way. But if he didn't, this doesn't count towards that. Being on the IL doesn't count towards his rookie eligibility. Mitchell's a good example of it, actually, because he's only got next season before it becomes arbitration following 2025. And if you look at like games played and everything, you would think he'd probably have at least one more before that. But because of all his time spent on the IL, he has accrued that much service time to be at that point in his arbitration process. So that's where Gasser's at too. But yeah, I've been trying to figure it out because the prospect incentive thing is always interesting, but I don't think he'll be back in time to even be in any consideration for Rookie of the Year. I just was curious on it, but either way, he wouldn't lose rookie eligibility, but he does lose the year of service time.
The discussion about putting guys in the big league IL versus the minor leagues is what I'm going to use as the segue here, or the transition into Spencer's minor league sandbox. You all know it. You all love it. I'll let you take it away.
All right. Unfortunately, it hasn't been the most exciting couple of weeks, and especially this week for the minor league side. So I'm going to highlight a few names, but I don't have as many as I might normally. Casey Hunt, talked about him a ton, undrafted guy last year, all the way into AA. He didn't have a great start tonight. He had walk issues for really the first time in his pro career, and I'll touch on his AA stats before this game in a second, but he walked 5 in 4 innings today and allowed 2 earned runs and was not able to get past the 4th inning. Prior to tonight, since he had been moved up to AA, he had thrown 22 innings with a 2.38 ERA, a 2.29 FIP, a 32.2% strikeout rate, and a 2.8% walk rate. So, like I said, the 5 walks were extremely out of character for him. He also had a 36.8% whiff rate, which was in line with his high A1, which is pretty impressive to be able to continue to carry that up the ladder. And again, as a starter who to start the year, he was coming out of the bullpen. He just keeps performing at every level. Obviously tonight was a little bit of a downturn, but even then he only gave up 2 earned runs in 4 innings, which is, I mean, he held his own. He was able to get through clearly a struggle of a game. So that's a good sign for a pitcher usually. Braylon Rodriguez, one I don't think I've talked about yet. He won my reliever of the month award, so I figured I'd shout him out on here. But he signed out of the DR in 2018. His second pro season because of COVID was 2021. He made it all the way up to Carolina that year. He missed all of 2022 with an arm injury. He struggled in the complex league in 2023. That's where he started again this year, but he is all the way up to high A with the Timber Rattlers now. His fastball is in that 92 to 93 range. It's topping out at 95. His best pitch is his low to mid 80 sliders, usually around 83. He throws it for strikes. He can get chases against it. He can kind of back foot it to lefties. And obviously against righties, it does well too. And he'll mix in a high 80s changeup. It lags quite a bit behind the other two pitches. It's just something to give him another look. But in August, he had a .89 ERA and he struck out 20 batters. So a very good job out of the pen for him in August. Another name, Garrett Stallings. He was acquired from Baltimore in the Thiago Vieira trade back in May. We talked about him when we acquired him. He's a six pitch guy. He throws all three fastballs. Brewers love that type of profile. 4-seam, 2-seam are both in that 90 to 92 range. Cutter is 87. Slider, curve, and changeup are all kind of in that upper 70s, low 80s, which I don't love that all three of those have similar velocity, but his changeup's a really good one. It's had a ton of whiffs all season. But in August, he moved to the bullpen. He had by far his highest whiff rate of any month. It was 34%. His previous high was 29. And his strikeout rate of 32.1% was over 10 points higher than his previous best in any month, which was 21.3. So the move to the pen helped him a lot, and it's good to see. I don't know that he's a major league arm, but he's a type of guy who's nice depth to have for the Brewers. On the offensive side, some cool news. The Brewers' first-round pick, Braylon Payne, was promoted to low A today. He's the youngest player at low A currently by only a few weeks, but still the youngest player there. And he tripled in his first professional at-bat tonight. So a little bit of a cheap triple. I'm not sure the guy would have caught it, but the right fielder was struggling with the sun and really misjudged where it was. So it ended up being a pretty easy triple, whereas it might have been a single or a double had he been able to play it correctly, but still, it was a pretty nice swing on it. Luke Adams, who I've talked about a ton, but he broke the Midwest League record for hit by pitches this year. He got hit for the 39th time this season, which is absolutely incredible. I do believe that is a skill. I will always say that. Being willing and able to get hit by a pitch and not jump out of the way is something that helps your on base, and I believe is something that it can be taught, but I also think it's a skill. Brock Wilken, somebody who it has been a really big struggle since the All-Star break, but coming into tonight, he had homered in back-to-back games, which was really nice to see. Hopefully he can finish the season on a high note and carry that into an off season where he will be a little bit further removed from that hit by pitch to the face, give him kind of a clean off season to kind of reset everything, and hopefully everything will come back around where we saw him in spurts this year. He had some really good runs at times this season. So good to see the back-to-back games with homers. And then one name that this really isn't a prospect, but I want to give him a little bit of love because I've watched a lot of Timber Rattlers games this year, and he's been very noticeable. Ramon Rodriguez, he signed as a minor league free agent this offseason. He was at AAA last year. The Brewers assigned him to high A. That's tough for a player to do that. I mean, he probably signed knowing that was going to be the case, but when you're one step away from the majors and then you get knocked down 2 pegs, basically, it's impressive to be able to be willing to do that. And also, if you've watched the Timber Rattlers with him catching or anything this year, by all accounts, he's just worked extremely hard. He's a great clubhouse guy, a great catcher to work with pitchers. Like, he works really well with those guys. He teaches them a lot. He's 25 years old, so he's been through every level of the minors. He's seen guys who went to the majors. It's good to have that type of guy working with a young pitching staff. He's a good defender, and he's had a really nice few weeks with the bats. So that's why I wanted to highlight him. He's got 67 plate appearances in August and September. He's hitting .312, .373 on base, .492 slug for an .865 OPS. He's hit 3 homers in that time. Like I said, he's unlikely to ever be anything big, but it's kind of to highlight the fact that these signings and players are really important to what the Brewers do in the minor league system, and having good clubhouse guys and guys who are willing to work with younger players and willing to show up every day, knowing that they're really just here to be that type of guy, almost an extension of the coaching staff. It's always cool to see those guys have success on top of everything else that they're doing. So wanted to shout him out. And then we'll finish off the minor league section with some injuries. Bishop Letson was placed on the 7-day IL for Carolina. It kind of feels like another one of the limiting innings type of injured list assignments. It didn't seem like there was anything actually noticeably wrong with him in his last appearance. On the other hand, Jason Woodward, who I'd talked about a little bit, was also placed on the 7-day IL. He was noticeably in pain in his last start. He looked to be pretty upset. Hopefully it's nothing major. He is coming off of Tommy John, so hopefully it's nothing related to that. I have no idea what it is, so I'm not going to speculate further, but he did look pretty upset when he got taken out of the game. Aiden Maldonado got activated for Wisconsin. I've talked about him on here before, and then Manuel Rodriguez was activated for Carolina. So a couple names I've talked about before back with their teams as they head into their playoff push, because both of those teams will be playing in the playoffs due to first half, winning their league in the first half. So that'll wrap up the minor league side. Jack, what do we got for injury updates?
Oh no, I did this wrong. It's never easy for me to bring this back in because I never quite know when you're going to finish. But we can talk about some injury updates. So we talked about Bryce Wilson being placed on the 15-day IL with a right oblique injury. Sounds like that's not going to be long term, but again, we'll kind of see just where he fits in the Brewers bullpen if he is ready to return before the end of the regular season. Nick Mears, who is on the injured list with a right forearm injury, said that the pain was starting to go away for him, so he was going to start playing catch on the homestand. He did start playing catch on the homestand. He was out there a couple days ago, so we'll see if or when he's ready to return before the end of the regular season. We mentioned Brian Hudson before. I'm going to put him in this section simply because there is an element of they just want to get him right physically. He was optioned to the minor leagues to AAA Nashville. Yeah. Obviously has the really good surface level numbers for the Brewers this year. It's been a very major part of their bullpen as kind of a multi-inning, high leverage machine back there. The velocity for him, just it has not come back. And this is so the Pat Murphy described the option to AAA as like a refresher for Brian Hudson. It sounds like he's going to have some more like scheduled outings and scheduled workload. It sounds like he's going to get a little bit of time away from the mound first, but the velocity has dipped gradually throughout the course of the year, and it's dipped especially heavily lately, which is not just true of the fastball. I wrote about this actually. The bigger concern for me is not so much that his fastball was averaging 89 over the last several outings. It's that his sweeper has lost like almost 5 miles an hour on average from where it was in June. Because the fastball is never going to play because of the velocity, but the sweeper, obviously velocity is not everything for a breaking ball, but when you have a pitch that's meant to move more like that, the combination of that movement coming in at that kind of speed, I just think there's more impact on the sweeper when there's a loss of velocity there than there is on the fastball. But there's also just the fact that the velocity loss on the sweeper is like way higher than the fastball. The fastball's lost like maybe 2 ticks from where it averaged early in the year. The sweeper, like I said, has lost almost 5. And if you look at the Stuff Plus ratings available on Fangraphs, they're not an end-all, be-all. There are, I think, some flaws with those metrics, especially compared to how the Brewers seem to evaluate guys, because you see a lot of guys they've picked up who don't grade out especially great by Stuff Plus who have done well. But the point stands, Brian Hudson's sweeper based on Stuff Plus with the loss of velo has gone from a really good pitch in the first half, just grading out that way based on its pitch qualities, the physical qualities of the pitch, to now grading out as a very well below average pitch. And he hasn't used it nearly as much over the last few weeks. Like, to me, that's what you really need to get right. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's kind of what the Brewers saw too. But I don't like to be negative about this kind of stuff, but like I'm really skeptical. I'm not sure there's anything left in the tank for this year because yes, this is obviously a more extensive refresh than anything he's ever done before, but it's his third reset period since the start of July. He had the All-Star break to reset. The velocity did not come back after that. He hit the injured list with the oblique and was out for 2 weeks. The velocity did not come back after that. So I'm not sure that this is necessarily something where it's you can give him some time off and it comes back. Maybe it's a little bit more extensive here to the point where they can get something back, but I'm not expecting it given that the first 2 attempts at a rest did not bring it back. It's looking to me a lot like we're just at a point where he just does not have that version of himself left in the tank within this season. Like, he needs an off season to really get it back. I hope I'm wrong, but that's just kind of what I'm expecting based on what we've seen over the last couple months for him now.
Yeah, I agree. It's unfortunate. It was part of the reason we had some concerns with some of the usage and stuff early, but I honestly think he's never thrown this many innings, and it just seems like it caught up to him a little bit, and it happens. But especially a guy with his build and how in sync everything has to be at that size for him to be going
Yeah.
well, like all it takes is a slight hindrance to that, and it can really change things dramatically for a guy that size. So hopefully he can find it in AAA, but it's September and he's gonna be time's running short on him figuring it out, I guess, this year. And yeah, it's
Yeah.
unfortunate because in June you would have thought that's one of our most important playoff relievers, and now you can see a scenario where he isn't on that roster.
Maybe. It depends where he's at physically. If he's in a spot where he feels good enough to keep pitching even if the stuff doesn't quite come back, I think there's still a pretty decent chance they put him on
Yeah,
the roster. Is it going to work? I'm not sure. I know the results were still fine after the All-Star break, but a lot of the peripherals were not, or
yeah,
at least they weren't close to what they were in the first half. Especially the strikeout rate has basically the swing and miss has just disappeared. It's not there
yeah,
anymore, and he's basically just getting by on every single batted ball, finding a glove. He's not getting hit hard, and I think that's where you're still seeing some of the deception come in with the delivery, but you'd like to get that form back. There's a reason why the Brewers are emphasizing that. But also just I do wanna note, like, yes, he's been used a lot. This is not like Pat Murphy's fault or anything. Like,
no, no,
you
no,
were in a spot where you needed relief innings. He was pitching really well, and he has been a guy who has been a multi-inning reliever in the minor
yeah,
leagues. I think sometimes maybe there's added stress with doing it in the big leagues, but also just I don't think enough people realize just I think his mechanics are just incredibly taxing for a guy with his
oh
build.
yeah,
And Murphy has kind of hinted at that with he's talked like multiple times throughout the year about how he just doesn't bounce back very well. Like for a and I'm not saying he's not like comfortable with his mechanics, but like the he's just a really big guy. And the way he moves his body, the slot that he throws from, the way he throws across his body, like it's just tough. It can be tough in general for a big guy just to move around like that in general, but I think just the unorthodox way he throws as well makes it even tougher. Like, I think it is his natural way of moving, but it's just really taxing on him too. And I think that that's kind of what we're seeing right now. It's just a big guy who is probably not quite physically where you'd like him to be, even if he's healthy enough to pitch. So now you're sending him down and you kind of see what you can get out of him. So we'll kind of see what happens over the next few weeks, but hopefully we see Brian Hudson again. I'm not holding my breath personally that you get him back to where he was before, but I do think we'll see him again one way or another. But we'll kind of see how the Brewers choose to approach this reset period in the minor leagues. We'll wrap up by previewing the Rockies series. Colorado coming to town for a 3-game set in Milwaukee. Game 1, Frankie Montas is going to start that one opposite Ryan Feltner. That is a 5:10 p.m. first pitch. You talked about football being back, Spencer.
I
Well,
know.
guess what? That means the first pitch times change, so I hope you're happy. Game 2, Tobias Myers is going to start. That's a 6:10 first pitch, and then Sunday is a day game. Freddie Peralta It's also Jackson Churio bobblehead day. But the Rockies have not announced a starter as of this recording for the Saturday or Sunday games, but we will be back with you to tell you who did start. You probably know that already, but we'll have some action to break down is the bottom line. Until then, thank you all for listening, and we'll talk to you next week. Go Brewers. Spencer, is there anything you want to add at the end of that, or can we cut it?
We can cut it.
We can cut it. All right. Thank you all for listening. We'll talk to you again next week.